Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about waking up, which, let's be honest, is already kind of an unpleasant topic. Especially if you're here, lying in bed, eyes half shut, maybe listening to my voice because you can't fall asleep. And now I'm about to talk about people waking up. Sorry about that. But don't worry, this will be the most boring way to learn about mornings you've ever experienced. So settle in, dim the lights, maybe fluff your pillow a little. Because tonight we're going to drift through time, way, way before iPhones, alarm tones, or that one coworker who texts GM, parentheses, at 6:01 a.m. We're going to float into a world where people still manage to get up, somehow, without a single beep, beep, beep to ruin their dreams. And of course, because humans are both ingenious and slightly ridiculous, the ways they did it ranged from clever to absurd. So let's start right at the beginning, the ancient world, where the sun, roosters, and occasionally someone yelling at you did most of the heavy lifting. Now, in ancient Egypt, waking up wasn't exactly optional. You had a job, usually in a field, building something massive for a god, or if you were lucky, painting eyes on a coffin lid. The sun was your alarm clock. When it rose, you rose. Simple. The Nile's rhythm dictated your life. Flooding, planting, harvesting. There wasn't really such a thing as sleeping in. You either got up or you got replaced. But Egyptians were smart. They noticed that not everyone wakes up just because of sunlight, especially if you'd spent the previous night drinking date wine or complaining about your supervisor in hieroglyphs. So some workers, especially in large building crews, had human alarm clocks. Actual people, overseers or timekeepers whose job it was to go around shouting, banging on doors, or otherwise making sure the workforce didn't decide to sleep through pyramid construction. Imagine that as your job title. Professional waker. The ancient version of your mom yelling, "You're gonna be late," except with more sand and probably fewer emotional boundaries. The Greeks, of course, decided to make everything more complicated, as they usually did. They loved time, obsessed with it. They built early water clocks, or clepsydra, which basically measured time through dripping water. It was kind of like watching a leaky faucet and pretending it's productivity. Some clever Greeks even adapted these clocks to make sound. As the water filled a vessel, it would trigger a mechanism that released compressed air, making a whistle or a small chime. Congratulations, that's humanity's first automatic alarm. It didn't exactly wake up a household, but maybe a philosopher who had to get to the agora before Socrates started debating morality again. By the Roman era, things hadn't gotten more advanced, just louder. Roosters were still the main morning influencers. Cocks crowing, slaves shouting, carts rolling, soldiers drilling. Rome wasn't quiet. If you lived there, you didn't need an alarm clock, you needed earplugs. Fun fact, there were actually laws against bakers starting work too early in some neighborhoods because the noise of kneading and clattering ovens woke up senators who preferred to stay in bed until noon. So even 2,000 years ago, rich people were already annoyed by morning people. Let's float forward a bit to medieval Europe, where waking up was, let's say, inconsistent. There was no standard time. The sun, again, decided when your day began. Except the sun doesn't rise at the same time every day, so technically, medieval people were never on time, just vaguely adjacent to it. Monks, though, were the big exception. They had prayers to attend at very specific hours, including matins, the night vigil that happened before dawn, which meant someone, somewhere, had to wake up in the dark, in a freezing stone abbey, light a candle and ring a bell for everyone else. These early rising monks were the spiritual ancestors of alarm clocks, except instead of buttons and buzzers, they had guilt and duty. They might have used water clocks, sand glasses, or just pure internal anxiety to wake themselves up. Later, monasteries even employed knocker-uppers of their own, monks whose sole duty was to wake the others. Picture a sleepy brother with a torch going door to door at 3 a.m., muttering psalms under his breath and knocking politely on wooden doors. You'd think holiness would be enough motivation, but even in the Middle Ages, people loved to hit snooze. By the Renaissance, things got fancier and weirder. The invention of mechanical clocks changed everything, but also nothing, because they were massive, expensive, and wildly inaccurate. Towns often had one big public clock tower, usually wrong, but proudly wrong. People would set their daily rhythms by those bells. Farmers would start work, markets would open, churches would pray, and nobody had to worry about exact time. There was no 8 a.m. meeting. There was just when the bell rings. But in cities, as life became more scheduled, some jobs needed early risers, bakers, lamplighters, and later factory workers. And so by the 18th century, the knocker-upper was born. Let's pause there, because this is honestly one of the most charmingly stupid jobs in history. A knocker-upper's entire job was to wake people up. That's it. You paid them a few pennies a week, and in exchange, they'd come to your house in the early morning and knock on your window with a long stick or shoot peas at your glass with a straw until you stirred. Some had small hammers. Others used bamboo poles. Some even carried tiny ladders for multi-story clients. They were like pre-industrial alarm apps, customized, personal, and occasionally passive-aggressive. If you think your alarm tone is annoying, imagine being woken by a stranger smacking your window every morning. But hey, it worked. And it created one of the earliest service economies built entirely around sleep deprivation. Knocker-uppers were mostly women in northern England, especially industrial towns like Manchester and Liverpool. They'd wake up before dawn, make their rounds in foggy streets, tapping on windows while factory chimneys started belching smoke. And yes, they often had to wake up the people who would in turn wake up others, which means some knocker-uppers needed another knocker-upper. Humanity has always been a bit recursive that way. Meanwhile, in richer homes, things were more automated. Sort of. There were alarm clocks, but not like the plastic nightmares on our bedside tables. These were ornate contraptions of gears and bells, often built into candle clocks or mechanical sculptures. Some would drop small balls onto a gong when the wax melted to a certain point. Others would open shutters to let in light. One design literally pulled on your toe with a string. Romantic. But most people didn't own clocks. They relied on church bells, roosters, or neighbors. A lot of early industrial workers simply timed their lives by the sound of the factory whistle, which, honestly, was the 19th century version of a phone notification. It screamed, "You moved." As we drift into the 1800s, things start to look more familiar and more miserable. Factories needed workers to arrive on time, and on time finally meant something measurable. Clocks were everywhere. Railways connected cities, demanding standard time zones. Being late wasn't just lazy anymore, it was unprofitable. So people invested in alarm clocks. By 1876, the first mechanical wind-up alarm clocks were common, with a little bell on top that could rattle your soul out of your body. They were loud, cheap, and hated. Perfect for capitalism. But even then, many workers still couldn't afford them. So the knocker-uppers stayed in business well into the early 20th century. In some towns, you could still find an old lady with a long stick peering up through the dawn mist, tapping a window for a few pennies. There's something oddly poetic about that. A tiny ritual from the past still holding on as the world industrialized. Let's float further to the modern era. Now we have phones, smartwatches, apps, Alexa screaming at us, "It's 7 a.m., rise and shine." We can choose between 400 alarm sounds, or even our favorite song, which we then proceed to hate within a week. And yet, despite all the progress, we still struggle to wake up. Maybe it's the comfort of the bed. Maybe it's that the human soul wasn't designed for 6 a.m. emails. But it's funny to think that even after thousands of years, our biggest technological advancements, from sundials to iPhones, haven't made mornings any less painful. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've now time-traveled through about 5,000 years of humanity's least exciting innovation, the art of waking up. From Egyptian taskmasters to medieval monks, from water clocks to knocker-uppers, it's all been one long, groggy attempt to stop being unconscious on time. The age of ingenious and ridiculous alarms. So you've made it this far. You're either genuinely interested in the history of waking up, or you've fallen asleep, and your subconscious is still politely pretending to listen. Either way, that's fine. That's kind of the point. Let's ease our way into the next chapter, or rather, the next drowsy stretch of human ingenuity, where people decided that if the sun, bells, or other humans couldn't wake them up, maybe machines could. Bad idea, of course, but humans are nothing if not optimistic when it comes to ruining their own rest. It all starts, unsurprisingly, in the Renaissance and early modern Europe, where people had a dangerous combination of spare time and access to gears. See, mechanical clocks had become more common in cities by the 1600s. Wealthy merchants and nobles could afford them, and the very concept of accurate time had become fashionable, like NFTs, but with brass and springs. And once you had a clock that could tell the time, it didn't take long for someone to ask the obvious question, can it also scream at me? One of the earliest known alarm mechanisms came from the 15th century in the form of a candle clock. It was simple, charming, and slightly terrifying. Here's how it worked. You'd take a tall candle, mark it with metal pins at certain intervals, and as it burned down during the night, the wax would melt and the pin would drop, hitting a metal plate or bell. Congratulations, you've just invented the world's most flammable timepiece. The good news? It didn't require winding. The bad news, you were sleeping next to an open flame. There's probably a reason the candle alarm never went mainstream, namely the risk of setting yourself on fire while trying to get 8 hours of rest. But still, the idea was clever. Using the slow, predictable passage of time through a burning object to trigger a noise. This concept actually survived into the 19th century in different forms, including oil lamp clocks and incense clocks in Asia, which would release fragrance instead of noise. Because, let's face it, being gently woken by the smell of sandalwood is much more civilized than having a hammer hit a bell beside your head. Now, as Europe industrialized, things escalated quickly, as they always do when humans start adding springs to stuff. The 17th and 18th centuries saw an explosion of personal alarm inventions, most of them designed by people who, frankly, had too much coffee and too little sleep. There were bed alarms, literal beds rigged with mechanisms that would tip, shake, or collapse at a certain time. You'd set your clock, and when the moment came, it would unlatch a support, causing your mattress to tilt or drop you onto the cold floor. It sounds violent, and it was, but some inventors were proud of this feature. They called it efficient, because apparently nothing says good morning than mild head trauma. One 19th century design featured a clock attached to a pulley that yanked the pillow from under your head. Another released cold water onto your face. One particularly creative and slightly sadistic model was built to ring a bell, flash a light, and physically slap the sleeper with a padded arm. You know, subtle. But not all alarm mechanisms were this aggressive. They were more delicate. In the 18th century, French inventors created clockwork contraptions that played music instead of ringing. These musical alarms used tiny pinned cylinders, like early music boxes, that chimed soft melodies at dawn. They were marketed to the aristocracy, of course, because if you're a duke or duchess, you can't just wake up to bells like a peasant. You must awaken to something refined, like a miniature orchestra hidden inside a clock. The irony? Those delicate tunes were probably so quiet that the servants still had to come shake you awake anyway, so effectively, the only people hearing the musical alarm were the maids cleaning up afterwards. Now, let's drift eastward for a moment, because Asia, as always, had its own brilliant and often more serene solutions. In ancient China and Japan, people had used incense clocks for centuries. These were beautiful, long, carved wooden boxes filled with coiled incense trails that burned steadily through the night. Small strings or threads were tied along the incense line, sometimes connected to metal balls. When the flame reached a thread, it burned through, dropping a ball onto a plate, making a soft ding. You could even smell your way through time. Each section of the incense had a slightly different scent, marking the passage of hours. Elegant, calm, aromatic, and still less stressful than the iPhone's radar alarm tone. In some Buddhist temples, monks use these to time meditation sessions or pre-dawn prayers. And honestly, that feels right. If you have to wake up at 4 a.m. for enlightenment, it might as well smell nice. But back in Europe, though, by the 1800s, time had become serious. Factories, trains, schools all demanded precision. Time was no longer a suggestion, it was a schedule. So the idea of personal timekeeping became a necessity. Enter the mass-produced mechanical alarm clock. In 1847, a French inventor named Antoine Redier patented the first adjustable alarm clock, meaning you could actually set what time it went off. Revolutionary in the sense that now you could precisely choose the moment you regretted existing. Redier's design spread quickly, and soon companies in America, Britain, and Germany began making cheap versions for workers. One of the biggest manufacturers was Westclocks, whose 1908 Big Ben alarm became the stuff of legend. Loud enough to wake a household, sturdy enough to survive being thrown across the room. There's a reason the phrase "ringing like a Big Ben" stuck around. It was less an alarm and more a small domestic explosion. But here's something most people don't know. Before electricity, even mechanical alarm clocks weren't very reliable. They could lose minutes, even hours overnight. So many people still relied on outside signals, like church bells or factory whistles, to confirm the time. And that's why the knocker-uppers kept existing well into the 20th century. Yes, in an era when cars and telephones existed, someone was still walking the streets with a long stick, tapping on people's windows to say, "It's morning." Some even worked with the local police, ensuring that shift workers were on time. In places like Bolton and Wigan, England, it was a respected trade. There were professional associations, routes, and regular clients. Imagine that. Your neighborhood alarm clock was a human being in a shawl with a bamboo cane. Kind of cozy, honestly. And then came electricity, the real game changer. The first electric alarm clock was patented in 1890 by a man named Seth E. Thomas, who probably had no idea he was creating the future bane of every teenager's existence. Electric clocks didn't need winding, and they could be synced with central power grids, which meant, for the first time, alarms could be accurate down to the minute. By the 1930s and 40s, the electric alarm clock was everywhere. By the 1950s, it was built into radios, the birth of the clock radio, the world's first multitasking sleep ruiner. You could now wake up not just to bells, but to the morning news. A different kind of nightmare entirely. But, of course, humans didn't stop there, because the 20th century loved innovation, which in this case meant finding new ways to be annoyed awake. There were vibrating alarms for the deaf, flashing light alarms for heavy sleepers, and even flying alarm clocks. Yes, literal propeller-powered devices that would launch themselves off your nightstand until you got up to chase them. There was even a 1980s bed shaker alarm, which vibrated the entire mattress. The marketing tagline might as well have been, "Wake up," or "Get motion sickness trying." And then, of course, came the smartphone, the alarm to end all alarms. A portable, programmable, omnipresent reminder that time exists and you're already late. Now, here's the funny thing. After thousands of years of inventing, improving, and electrifying the process of waking up, studies show that people are still terrible at it. We still oversleep. We still hit snooze. We still wake up groggy and resentful. It's almost poetic. The ancient farmer rising with the sun and the modern office worker swiping at their phone have the exact same energy, that deep, primal sigh of, "Not yet." So how did people wake up before alarm clocks? They didn't. Not really. They were woken by the sun, by sound, by someone else, by habit, or by sheer survival instinct. And maybe that's the lesson buried under all these centuries of timekeeping, that waking up has always been less about technology and more about willpower. But tonight, thankfully, that's not your problem, because you don't have to wake up. You just have to drift past the monks and the factories, the ticking gears and flickering candles, into whatever soft, timeless place sleep takes you. So, good night, traveler through time. And may your morning alarm, however it finds you, be a gentle one. The Dawn Whisperers and Candle Conspiracies. All right, so we left off somewhere between monks chanting their way into dawn and peasants praying they'd wake up before their cows did. But now, let's float gently into a slightly more peculiar phase of human alarm history. Because waking up wasn't just about the sun, the church, or nature. No. Humans being humans, we had to complicate it with gadgets, rituals, and occasionally professional wake-up people. Yes, actual people whose job it was to wake others up. Let's start with the knocker-uppers, a name that sounds far less wholesome than it actually was. These were mostly working-class folks in 18th and 19th century Britain and Ireland, hired to make sure factory workers, mill hands, or dock laborers got up on time for their brutal early shifts. Their job? Go around town in the dim pre-dawn, tapping on people's windows with a long stick, sometimes bamboo, sometimes an old fishing rod. They'd poke at your window pane until you stirred or yelled or threw something back. Some used pea shooters for higher windows. Imagine that, you're half asleep and a stranger's outside softly spitting peas at your window at 4:30 a.m. The best part? There was no guarantee they'd wake you up, no refunds either. So it was sort of a trust-based, semi-reliable human alarm system. One woman in Manchester was famously known as Mary the Knocker-Upper. She worked until she was almost 70. She carried a lantern, a long cane, and, by all accounts, had the patience of a saint and the voice of a crow. Of course, there was always the question, who woke up the knocker-upper? The answer varies, but usually they either didn't sleep or they relied on other knocker-uppers, a self-sustaining circle of sleep deprivation. industrial Britain in its finest form. But long before Mary and her crew, people were already experimenting with ways to control the moment of waking. In medieval monasteries, some monks used water clocks, slow dripping devices that would overflow and make a noise, or even tip over a small bell when full. These were early proto-alarms, but more damp. And the candle method? That was a thing too. People would take a candle and mark it with pins inserted at specific heights. As the candle burned down, the wax melted and released the pins, which would drop onto a metal plate or a tin cup below. Clink! Congratulations! It's 5 a.m. and your house smells like hot tallow. You can almost hear the mental process. I need to wake up early. I'll just set fire to something in my bedroom. Humanity's relationship with risk has always been ambitious. Some particularly dedicated people even tied small strings to their toes connected to the candle pin, so when the candle burned down enough, tug, a literal fire-powered tow alarm, because, of course, that made sense to someone. Then there were the servant systems. If you were rich, waking up wasn't your problem. Someone else handled it. In grand manor houses, servants had the unenviable job of creeping into rooms quietly before dawn, pulling curtains open just enough to let in the first gray light, or worse, pouring water into basins a little too loudly. Some nobles requested to be woken softly. Others demanded trumpets, clapping, or dogs. The Duke of Wellington, for example, famously insisted his valet wake him up exactly at 6 each morning, regardless of circumstance, a man who believed punctuality could win empires. Meanwhile, peasants and farmers relied on something much more honest, the animals. Roosters, sure, but also cows bellowing from milking, dogs barking at every bird, or the neighbor's donkey declaring its existence to the universe. Nature's alarm clock had no snooze button, but it sure had volume. Let's drift, though, into the Renaissance and Enlightenment, that period when humans began thinking, maybe we can build something smarter than a candle or a chicken. Inventors began tinkering with mechanical alarm clocks. The first known mechanical alarm clock was built around 1555 by a German locksmith named Peter Henlein, or so the legend goes. His clocks had a small dial where you could set a pin, and when the main clock's hand reached it, ding! Except, again, these weren't affordable for anyone who wasn't already awake counting their gold coins. So, for most people, the old methods stuck around. Water, candles, neighbors, and sheer anxiety. By the 1800s, factories demanded precision. People couldn't just wake up when the rooster crows anymore. The steam engine waited for no one. That's when alarm clocks started becoming household items. But before we get there, let's drift over, gently, quietly, into another corner of the past, somewhere between superstition and survival, where waking up wasn't just mechanical, it was spiritual. Because, believe it or not, for centuries, people believed dreams could choose your waking time. Let's explore that next. How ancient people tried to dream their way into daylight. Dreaming the dawn, when waking was a spiritual affair. So we've tapped on windows, burned candles, and tugged on toes. But let's float even deeper into the world before alarm clocks, where people didn't just wake up, they believed they were called to wake up. You see, before science explained things like sleep cycles or circadian rhythms, waking up was often considered mystical. For many ancient and medieval people, dreams were messages, and the moment of waking, that was when those messages were delivered. In ancient Egypt, for example, priests believed that certain dreams came from the gods and could only be interpreted if you woke naturally. So they'd sleep in temples, surrounded by incense and silence, waiting for divine visions. Waking up before sunrise wasn't about getting to work early. It was about catching the last whispers of a god before morning light erased them. The Greeks and Romans had their own spin on this. Aristotle, because of course it's always Aristotle, suggested that waking moments could be controlled by your internal spirit. Basically, your soul had an alarm clock, which is both poetic and deeply inconvenient. In medieval Europe, peasants often prayed before sleep for a gentle waking. They believed if you woke suddenly, your soul might be startled and wander. Not a great start to the day. Hence, alarm clocks, when they arrived, were sometimes seen as unholy. The idea that a machine could decide when you rise, that was almost witchcraft. There are records of early clerics complaining that alarm bells might disturb the harmony of divine rest. But the monks? Oh, the monks were practical. They needed bells. Prayer didn't schedule itself. In monasteries, elaborate night watches were organized. One monk would stay awake to tend candles, read psalms, and, most importantly, wake the others, quietly, softly, like a holy knocker-upper with better robes. Sometimes they go room to room whispering, Benedicamus Domino, let us bless the Lord. Imagine waking up to that every morning. Peaceful, yes, but probably tiresome after the first decade. Meanwhile, outside those stone walls, regular folks relied on nature. The sound of wind through shutters, roosters crowing, or the warmth of sunlight creeping across their faces. Those who rose too early were said to be friend of the dawn, while those who slept late were labeled as slothful, one of the 7 deadly sins no less. But there's a charming in-between that we've mostly forgotten today, the first sleep and the second sleep. That's right. For centuries, people didn't sleep straight through the night. They'd go to bed not long after dusk, sleep for 4 hours, wake up for 1 or 2, pray, eat, talk, think, and then go back to bed until dawn. This 2-sleep system was perfectly normal up until the 18th century. The waking period in the middle of the night was considered a time for reflection, or intimacy, or quiet reading. People called it the watch. In a sense, you didn't need an alarm clock. Your body was the alarm. You'd wake around midnight, stretch, maybe stir the fire, mutter a short prayer, or stare out the window at the stars, then drift back down for your second rest. Imagine that rhythm, the deep quiet of night, then a small pocket of awareness, then back into sleep. It's almost meditative. Modern sleep scientists even think it might have been healthier. But of course, the Industrial Revolution stomped all over that. When factories and trains arrived, time stopped being flexible. You couldn't have 2 sleeps when your boss expected you at 6 a.m. sharp. The world demanded punctuality, and that meant something new had to wake you, reliably, brutally, and without poetic grace. Enter the mechanical alarm clock revolution. The earliest versions were handcrafted pieces of art. Expensive, yes, but effective. By the 19th century, inventors in France, Germany, and the US were filing patents for clocks with all kinds of odd mechanisms. Bells, chimes, spinning plates, even small hammers that tapped your bed frame. One particularly deranged design by a British inventor involved a spring-loaded hammer that literally slapped you with a feather. Gentle, in theory, absurd in practice. Then, in 1876, a man named Seth E. Thomas from Connecticut patented one of the first mass-produced mechanical alarm clocks. It was sturdy, affordable, and very loud. Americans loved it. Sleep did not. But this moment marked a quiet revolution. Humanity had, at last, outsourced the sacred act of waking to a machine. No more dreams, no more candles, no more monks whispering Latin in the dark. Just a cold, metallic ring demanding obedience. Still, not everyone was thrilled. Farmers complained that alarm clocks were unnatural. Philosophers claimed it made people servants of time. Some folks genuinely believed it would cause madness, the constant noise breaking a person's spirit. And honestly, maybe they weren't wrong. Because once alarm clocks took over, time started ruling us instead of the other way around. The bell factories didn't just wake workers, they synchronized them. 1,000 alarms ringing at once, pulling thousands of bodies from beds, creating the pulse of industrial civilization. The human rooster was now obsolete. Let's drift a bit now, past the clamor of metal bells and factory whistles, into something quieter, into the idea of why we still need alarms at all. If you think about it, we've spent thousands of years fighting our own biology. We want control over sleep, over time, over the moment between dreaming and waking. But the irony? The more we've tried to master it, the less rest we've found. Modern life gives us glowing rectangles that tell us when to wake, when to work, when to scroll, when to panic. But none of them really wake us gently. Before alarm clocks, the world eased you into day, slowly, softly, with birds, bells, and breath. Now, we jolt into consciousness, heart racing, brain buzzing, already late. Sometimes I think the candle alarms had it right. A quiet flame, a gentle clink, a human-sized sound. We'll continue, in the next part, with the rise of industrial sleep, how factory bells, war sirens, and 20th century time discipline completely reshaped how the world wakes up and never quite went back to sleep. The Industrial Awakening, when time took over sleep. So let's gently stretch into the next part of this slow-motion disaster we call the modern morning. Picture it, the 19th century. Smokestacks, clanging metal, and men in waistcoats arguing about steam pressure. The world was speeding up, literally. Trains, factories, telegrams, everything was moving faster. Except, of course, the human body, which still preferred to nap after lunch. Before this era, time was mostly local. Noon was when the sun hit its highest point above your town, not when a train timetable said it was. But once railways connected cities, everyone had to agree on the same time. Or, as one London paper put it, the chaos of clocks will ruin commerce. And just like that, standard time was born. Suddenly, waking up whenever the sun rose wasn't enough. The world had schedules now, time zones, shifts, appointments, and they all began at the same minute for everyone. To enforce this new rhythm, factories installed bells, enormous, deafening things that rang at dawn to summon workers. In some towns, these bells were louder than church towers. Children grew up associating that sound not with worship, but with work. In many industrial cities, Manchester, Birmingham, Pittsburgh, the sound of the factory bell was so iconic that locals called it the Iron Rooster. It crowed once at sunrise, once at lunch, once at quitting time. No one asked whether it was healthy. No one cared whether your soul had reattached itself from sleep. It was time to produce. By the late 1800s, personal alarm clocks had become essential household items. Advertisements sold them as symbols of responsibility and manliness. One ad literally read, "The punctual man conquers the world." Another promised, "No more lazy mornings, rise like a leader." Of course, the same clocks were marketed to women with a slightly different tone. Wake refreshed and serve your family with joy. Subtle. Alarm clocks became moral objects, proof that you were civilized, disciplined, and reliable. If you woke naturally, suspicious. You might be poor, or worse, artistic. Meanwhile, philosophers were already grumbling. Henry David Thoreau, who famously lived in the woods, wrote, "I rise early each morning to see if I can meet the day on its own terms, not those of the clock." Good for him. The rest of us had bills. Still, even as clocks multiplied, humans kept inventing gentler ways to wake up. There were mechanical beds that tipped you onto the floor, alarms that slowly opened curtains. In Paris, a watchmaker built a tea alarm that poured hot water into a waiting cup at sunrise, arguably the most civilized invention in human history. But all of this technology had one effect. It trained us to think of sleep as an obstacle, not something to enjoy or surrender to, but something to overcome. Factories, offices, armies all wanted the same thing: people who woke up on time. And so we started organizing our entire lives around artificial hours. By the early 20th century, psychologists were already noticing the effects: anxiety, insomnia, fatigue. They called it time neurosis, a sense of being constantly chased by the clock. One London doctor, in 1908, wrote that his patients felt haunted by punctuality. He recommended they spend time in nature, where clocks are not consulted. Which sounds like an early form of digital detox, minus the hashtags. Then came electricity, and with it, artificial light. Now the night could last forever. Shops stayed open, factories ran through midnight. People stopped sleeping when their bodies told them to. They slept when their schedules allowed it. The rooster, the candle, the monk, all gone, replaced by the buzzing bulb and the metal bell. Let's pause for a moment here. Take a breath. Because what's interesting is how every generation since has tried to rebel against the clock, just a little. In the 1920s, people started buying silent alarm clocks, the ones that glowed softly and vibrated instead of ringing. Then came radio alarms, which promised to wake you gently with music. Then digital ones with snooze buttons, which just prolonged the suffering. And now in the 21st century, we have smart alarms. Apps that track your sleep cycles, sense your breathing, and choose the perfect time to wake you, within a half-hour window, of course. We've come full circle. We've reintroduced the idea of gentle waking, but through machines more complex than anything Seth Thomas could have imagined. Still, if you strip away the Wi-Fi and the marketing, it's the same ancient wish: to wake peacefully, to bridge that strange gap between night and day without feeling like you've been electrocuted. Let's drift a bit further now, from the age of industry into the modern bedroom. Because while we no longer rely on monks or roosters, we do rely on something far stranger: the glowing little slab beside our beds. Ah yes, the smartphone. Our new rooster, our new candle, our new overseer. It watches while we sleep, it buzzes when we must rise, it tells us when to breathe, stretch, eat, work, and panic. We've given up mechanical clocks for digital ones, but the trade-off is the same: obedience to time. Yet every so often, someone breaks the cycle, literally. They throw away their alarm, move to the countryside, let the sun decide, and they all say the same thing: I sleep better now. Maybe the monks were onto something. Maybe the Egyptian priests were right. Maybe waking up isn't supposed to be controlled. Maybe it's something the body already knows how to do if we just stop ringing at it. Let's glide toward the end now, back through the centuries, past the factory bells, past the candlelight, back to the field and the farm. Because the people who woke best, it seems, were the ones who didn't try too hard. They rose with warmth, not noise, with birdsong, not metal, with rhythm, not rules. And maybe, just maybe, that's the secret we've been snoozing through all along.
The return of natural time. Remembering how to wake. So, let's bim things down even further. You can probably feel it by now. That soft tug between centuries. The slow return from electric light to sunrise. We've walked through thousands of years of human mornings. From priests with water clocks to monks with bells. From roosters on rooftops to ticking brass gears And finally, to digital rectangles that glare at us before dawn. And yet, after all that progress, we still complain about waking up. It's funny, isn't it? We've built machines that can measure atomic seconds, but none that can make morning feel natural. Every alarm, no matter how advanced, is still a little betrayal of the body. Let's go back, just for a moment, to the earliest people. The farmers on the Nile, the shepherds in Mesopotamia, the fishermen on the Aegean coast. They didn't wake up in the way we mean it now. There was no violent transition between sleep and day. They drifted, slowly, like a tide rising. The first light would creep across the mud brick walls, over baskets of grain and sleeping children, and the body simply responded. Some of the earliest poems in the world, Egyptian hymns, Sumerian songs, talk about dawn as if it were a goddess. She opens the eyes of the sleepers, they say. Not forces them, opens. It's a lovely thought. A morning that feels like an invitation, not an alarm. Even in medieval monasteries, where life was ruled by bells, the monks described dawn as sacred calm. They didn't resent the first call of the day. They greeted it. There's a passage from the Rule of Saint Benedict that says, "Let us arise in the quiet before light to greet the day before the sun." Imagine waking like that. No notifications, no alarms, just quiet, candlelight, and the knowledge that you're about to see the sky turn gold again. Now compare that to the modern version. A phone vibrating, the screen exploding with reminders, your brain immediately shoved into a list of things to do. We've lost the art of waking softly. In many ancient societies, people actually slept in two shifts, the so-called first sleep and second sleep. They'd wake for an hour or two in the middle of the night, maybe talk, pray, even make food, then go back to bed. No one thought it was insomnia. It was just normal. The rhythm of night, the body deciding when to rest and when to reflect. But industrial life flattened that pattern. 8 hours to work, 8 to rest, 8 to whatever was left. A neat, efficient box of time. The irony is, the more we tried to control sleep, the worse it became. Even Thomas Edison, the man who brought us electric light, bragged that he slept only 4 hours a night. "Sleep is a waste of time," he said. "Sure, Tom. So is inventing motion pictures and then dozing off halfway through them." By the mid-20th century, sleep scientists started noticing something strange. The human brain didn't actually want to sleep in one long stretch. It wanted phases, waves, darkness and rest, followed by light and motion. We were trying to make time linear when it never really was. And maybe that's the core of it, why we struggle so much with waking. Because we built our world around the clock, not around the sun. Still, the pull toward natural time never went away. In the 1970s, a few experiments in France and the US tried isolating volunteers in underground bunkers. No clocks, no windows, no cues for day or night. Within weeks, every subject developed their own rhythm. Some slept 10 hours, some 6. Some shifted day by day, but almost all reported waking peacefully. When scientists asked how they knew when to wake, most said the same thing. "I just felt ready." There's something beautiful about that. The idea that beneath all our alarms and obligations, the body still remembers what it means to be aligned with the world. Today, we're seeing small echoes of that return. People using sunrise lamps, sleeping without curtains, syncing their routines to daylight instead of the clock. Farmers still rise early, yes, but not by force. They know when the air changes, when the birds start whispering, when the first light hits the horizon in that strange ancient color between gray and gold. And maybe that's what the future of waking looks like. Not more technology, but less. Not precision timing, but presence. After all, every morning, the world still performs its oldest trick. The light returns. The air warms. The sound of life begins again. You don't need a clock to tell you that. You just have to notice it. So if you're listening to this now, lying in the dark, the faint hum of the room around you, maybe that's enough. Maybe when this story ends, you won't need an alarm tomorrow. Maybe you'll just wake when the light decides it's time. No buzz, no beep, no panic. Just a quiet, ancient rhythm. Older than clocks, older than kings. Reminding you that morning was never something to conquer. It was always something to return to.